So I'm sure that that stimulates the questions on the platform. Maybe we can now stop on the presentation, and the time is really flying. So sorry for the participants. So we will start to ask a few questions just now, and for the question we will not ask. In fact, feel free, in fact, to send your question on the web platform, and we will answer to the question with our experts later on. So one of the first questions is, what's the difference between synthetic amino acids and amino acid present in the ingredients? And that's, I would say, typically for the formulator, but I would prefer maybe to ask Jaap and Mike to answer to that question.
Well, in pig nutrition, that's a question that was asked many years ago when Batterham did the study where he showed that, free amino acids, synthetic amino acids, are readily absorbable, and so they are immediately available to the animal, whereas perhaps the protein source, the energy sources or the other protein sources are not available. Many studies have been done ever since, and we have never really seen an effect, for instance, of feeding frequency on amino acid use. So in terms of metabolic, what the animal sees once it is absorbed is amino acids, peptides, but that's it. So a potential difference would be in the gut. And does the gut have receptors for amino acids or for proteins? And perhaps there is a response in that, but in practical feeding, I have not seen any difference in terms of amino acid use, free amino acid use compared to
even
protein.
when you compare, I would say, swine with meal feeding, and I would say broilers with more nibbler and eating the whole day and so on.
Yeah, and I won't go into detail with the work by Batterham because he explained that very well. But we have a meal-fed bird, and we've wondered the same thing in our conceptual idea of amino acid absorption. But what I would like to point to is the difference is we're looking at an individual amino acid versus a pool of amino acids. So as we feed, for example, high amino acid density diets for birds for an economic optimum in a certain scenario, we're moving the whole plane of nutrition forward. And when we do that with feed-grade amino acids, we're doing that with certain amino acids, and we're creating limitations in others. So that's another concept I think we need to be very, very keen to remember.
So sure, we can, I would say, debate a little bit more on that. So maybe we can take another question. Even if the time is flying, I think we have some time to answer to some questions. So an interesting question regarding the objectives. We always talk about breast meat. Do we consider that amino acid needs for the development of breast is the same for thigh and drumsticks?
You want to do the broiler one?
Maybe broiler for the
for pigs it will be more difficult.
So we look at the deboning typically of all the parts in the trials we do, and some of this was presented earlier this year at the Australian Poultry Science Symposium in Sydney. And with low protein diets, if we miss it, and typically, not typically, but many of the times we do miss it in formulation to get the response to where it needs to be, we have a reduction in breast meat yield. So by default, based on a yield-based parts percentage, with lower protein diets or with amino acid balance that's not geared toward optimizing white meat yield, because that's what the bird wants to do, you can maintain a feed conversion and increase dark meat yields at the same time. That's pretty clear.
But so you would recommend slightly different, I would say, amino acid profile in
absolutely
in Asia Pacific when they are concerned by more the rest of the carcass or the whole carcass, and the
you need to feed for feed conversion there because pushing the bird more for white meat yield, they probably don't want to push the bird more, but they're probably pushing feed conversion. But you don't need to push the bird in those environments to get the carcass percentage of dark meat yield, because that's going to be where the lower percentage of breast comes into play.
So that could be really interesting to reconsider that. Maybe a last question. It's based on the Cecile interview. As for meat quality, could we think about short-term amino acid supplementation for specific needs? You talk about gut health, you talk about different aspects beyond, I would say, meat quality. Have we considered, for instance, an extra supplementation of amino acids to solve a sanitary issue, to solve some gut functioning and so on?
Not that I know of. The first point that comes to my mind when you mention meat quality is looking at the withdrawal time in commercial broilers, potentially putting something in the water. We've got to remember the rapid turnover of amino acids, a pool of amino acids 48 to 72 hours. But we have experimented, for example, with tryptophan back in the 90s with Dr. Moran, looking at feeding or providing tryptophan in the water before slaughter to relax the birds in that particular environment. So I think we could also consider looking at amino acid supply prior to these situations for meat quality as well. And I don't want to get into something like myopathies, because I think that's identified long before the end of the trial, but for sure that would just be one example.
And next year, because you will be talking at our advanced year next year, so on hot conditions or environmental conditions would be quite another challenge on the amino acid requirements.
Yes.
I think time is really flying, so I'm sorry for the people who ask questions. So don't forget that you can still drop your questions on the web platform, and we'll answer to the question with our specialists. As a joke, I would say I would like to ask a question to our two invitees. For years and years, we think about the ideal protein based on the lysine, because it started on swine and so on, and it's an essential amino acid for swine. But in broilers or poultry, I would say the most essential one is methionine. Why not to have ideal protein based on lysine for swine and methionine for broilers?
Oh, and he puts
Who wants to comment on that?
He puts that to the poultry guy again.
Yeah. No, well, I mean. For lysine, for instance, we don't think just in terms of lysine, we in terms of lysine relative to net energy or metabolizable energy.
Yeah.
And we have to have a reference because lysine to net energy ratios change over the lifespan of an animal. And people have some idea about how it changes. Threonine to net energy will change the same way. Tryptophan to net energy will also change. So rather than having an image, how does amino acid relative to energy change? It's good to have a reference, and a lysine is a relatively stable reference. And then think of, well, how does threonine to lysine? What should the ratio be? Even though people sometimes think that threonine to lysine may change because the contribution of maintenance may change. So, is it important to change the reference? And should we have a reference? I think yes, because it makes life for nutritionists much simpler.
The question is really, in fact, to see if there is no bias when we consider poultry, for instance, compared to.
Would it make a difference if you would use methionine as a reference? I'm not sure.
Mike.
Well, yeah, we have a feather situation. I'm not sure we're going to know how to get around. Clearly, but with poultry, the same concept is true with the swine, and that is that lysine is highly limiting, and the whole body protein accretion is at a high rate versus maintenance is almost zero. So we have that same situation, even though lysine is not first limiting in poultry, but we need a reference, and these amino acids are interplaying. Threonine and methionine are interplaying when we look at the intestinal interaction type environments. So we need a reference. Is it the best one?
Yeah. As we said at the beginning, we need a reference. We need a common base.
Yeah.
So it may be the best situation.
But clearly, we have more to learn. So that question may be answered soon. Who knows?
Okay, thank you very much. So I would like to warmly thank our today speakers. So Dr. Jaap van Milgen from Rennes, and the Professor Mike Kidd from Arkansas, and also Lane from Cargill in Rotterdam. And I would say you will have the answer on all your questions on the web platform. You will be able to listen to the program again on the podcast and so on. You can. It will be divided in sections because already this time it's a bit long compared to the previous one, but you will have the possibility to look at the whole live webinar as well as different parts of the webinar. We hope you enjoy the webinar. You will continue to be addicted to the FeedChannel.online platform. We give you appointment for the next FeedChannel live webinar in February, mid-February, and it will be devoted to egg quality. And the next one in April, we'll go back to swine. I will give more information later on. So I would say bye-bye, everyone, and looking forward to seeing you next February. And because it's the final closing of the last webinar of 2017, I think I would like to, on behalf of the whole team on FeedChannel, to wish you Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.